The church doors swung open with a crack like a rifle shot, and every head in the pews of Caldwell, Kansas, turned at once. She stood in the doorway with dust on her blue traveling dress and wild eyes scanning the crowd, her chest heaving from the run she had clearly just made across Main Street. The afternoon light poured in around her like something out of a fever dream, turning her auburn hair into a crown of copper fire. In her gloved hand, she clutched a crumpled letter, and the expression on her face was one that Marshal Nelson Sutton had seen before only on men who had just discovered they had ridden into an ambush. He was standing at the back of the church, positioned near the aisle as was his habit at any large gathering, because large gatherings in Caldwell in the summer of 1878 had a way of turning dangerous without much warning. His hand had gone instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip before his brain had even registered that the threat was not gunfire but something else entirely. Something he could not name yet but could feel the way you feel a storm coming before a single cloud appears. The bride at the altar was Clarissa Hawthorne. The groom was Deputy Earl Dunmore. The preacher had just opened his Bible. And this woman, this breathless, dust-streaked, furious woman in the doorway, was staring at the groom like she wanted to tear the earth open beneath his feet. Earl Dunmore's face had gone the color of old bone. The congregation held a collective, suspended breath. Nelson stepped forward from his position near the back wall, his boots silent on the pine floor. He had dealt with saloon fights, cattle disputes, a bank robbery, and one very unfortunate incident involving a loose mountain lion in the general store. He had never once dealt with anything that felt quite like this. His eyes moved between the woman in the doorway and Dunmore at the altar, cataloging details the way a good lawman always did, the deputy's white knuckles, the bride's confused tears already forming, the way the woman in the doorway was advancing slowly up the center aisle with a terrible kind of quiet dignity that made the room feel like a tinderbox. "Earl Dunmore," she said, and her voice was steady and low, and carried to every corner of the church like a church bell striking midnight. "I want to know what you did with my brother." The silence after those words was so complete that Nelson could hear the candles on the altar flickering. And that was the moment, standing in the hushed and golden interior of the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, Kansas, with his hand still resting on the grip of his revolver, and every instinct he possessed pulled taut as a bowstring, that Marshal Nelson Sutton could not stop watching her. He had not been able to stop since. 3 weeks earlier, on a scorching Tuesday in late July, the town of Caldwell had been doing what it always did in the afternoon heat, baking slowly, and minding its business with varying degrees of success. Nelson had been in his office beside the jailhouse, writing a report on a cattle-rustling case that had turned out to be considerably less exciting than the rancher who reported it had made it sound. His deputy, Earl Dunmore, had been conspicuously absent, which was not entirely unusual. Earl had a habit of being where the work wasn't. Nelson was 29 years old, had been Marshal of Caldwell for 3 years, and had what the townspeople described behind his back as a gift for both order and silence. He did not talk more than necessary. He did not drink more than occasionally. He had no wife, no sweetheart, no particular soft spot for anything except perhaps the old sorrel mare named Agnes who lived in the livery stable, and who allowed only Nelson to brush her mane without taking a chunk out of whoever tried. He was not the brooding kind of man who made a spectacle of his solitude, but he was alone in the way that some men in some places simply were shaped by the landscape they worked in, hardened into something functional and quiet. The stage from Wichita arrived that Tuesday at 3:30, exactly when it was supposed to, which Nelson noted with absent approval from behind his report. Through the dusty window of his office he could see the usual small gathering at the stage stop, the postmaster collecting mail, a couple of cowboys hoping for packages, Mrs. Aldridge waiting on fabric she had ordered 2 months prior. He went back to his writing. He was still writing 10 minutes later when his door opened, and a woman he had never seen before walked into his office and said, without any preamble whatsoever, "Are you the law in this town?" Nelson looked up. She was not what he expected, not that he had been expecting anyone. She was perhaps 25 or 26, with a forthright, square-shouldered way of standing that suggested she was accustomed to being taken seriously and had learned, probably the hard way, how to demand it. Her traveling dress was a deep shade of blue that had seen some weather, and she carried a carpet bag with the strap gripped firmly in her right hand. Her hair was a deep auburn, pinned up but escaping in places. Her eyes, which met his directly and without flinching, were the color of strong tea, dark amber, clear and searching. "I am," Nelson said, setting down his pen. "Good." She stepped forward and placed a folded letter on his desk. "My name is Bessie Ford. I have come from Springfield, Missouri, looking for my brother, James Ford. He wrote to me 6 weeks ago saying he had taken a job with a cattle operation near Caldwell and then stopped writing entirely. I have reason to believe something has happened to him." Nelson picked up the letter. It was written in a man's hand, loose, energetic letters, slightly cramped at the end of each line, as though the writer had been running out of page before he ran out of things to say. The last date mentioned was 5 weeks and 4 days ago. "What cattle operation?" Nelson asked. "He mentioned a man named Dunmore," Bessie Ford said. Nelson went still for just a moment, not long enough for her to notice, but long enough for him to feel it himself. He set the letter back down on his desk. "Earl Dunmore," he said carefully. He did not give a first name. Nelson looked at her steadily. There were things he knew about Earl Dunmore and things he only suspected, and the line between those two categories had been troubling him for the better part of 2 months. Earl Dunmore was his deputy and had been for almost 2 years. He was also, Nelson had gradually come to understand, a man with a talent for presenting one face to a room while operating a different face entirely when no one was looking. Nelson had no proof of wrongdoing. He had only the slow, accumulating weight of small inconsistencies, money that didn't quite add up, absences that weren't quite explained, the way Earl's eyes moved when certain names came up in conversation. "Sit down, Miss Ford," Nelson said. She sat, straight-backed and watchful, setting her carpet bag beside the chair with the deliberate care of someone who had been traveling for a long time and had learned to keep her belongings close. "Tell me everything your brother said in his letters before this last one," Nelson said, and she did. Bessie Ford had a precise, ordered mind. She presented information the way a good witness did, sequentially, without embellishment, flagging her own uncertainties clearly and separating what she knew from what she guessed. Nelson listened with the focused attention he gave everything that mattered, and what she told him built a picture that he found deeply troubling. James Ford, 22 years old, had come to Caldwell in late spring looking for work. He had, according to his own letters, found it quickly with a man he described as a well-connected fellow who runs cattle out of the south pastures and pays fair. He had been happy in early June. By early July, the tone of his letters had changed in a way that Bessie had only recognized in retrospect. He had become vague where he had once been specific, and had written in one letter a line that she had puzzled over for weeks. "I have seen something out here that I am not sure what to do about, Bess. I expect I will work it out. Do not worry about me." She had worried about him anyway. Sisters generally did. She had come to Caldwell when the letters stopped. "Is Earl Dunmore the only Dunmore in the area?" she asked when she had finished. "He is the only one I know of," Nelson said. "And is he a man who runs cattle?" Nelson met her eyes. He chose his words with the care a man uses when he is walking across ice. "He has some land to the south. I am not certain he runs it himself." Bessie Ford studied him with those clear amber eyes and said, "You are not telling me everything you know." It was not an accusation exactly. It was a statement, and it was accurate. "Miss Ford," Nelson said, "I am going to look into this. I need you to give me a day before you do anything else." "A day," she repeated, as though calculating what a day cost against what it might gain. "1 day," he said. Stay at the boarding house on 2nd Street. Mrs. Cartwright runs it. Tell her I sent you. Do not go looking for Dunmore yourself." Something passed across her face at that, a flicker of something that was not quite stubbornness and not quite fear but lived somewhere between the two. "And if I do not agree to that, then you will likely make my job considerably harder," Nelson said, "and your brother's situation considerably worse." A beat of silence. The afternoon heat pressed against the window glass. "One day," Bessie Ford said, and picked up her carpet bag. After she left, Nelson sat very still at his desk for a long moment. Then he picked up his hat, buckled on his spare revolver alongside his regular one, and went to find Earl Dunmore. He did not find him that evening. Earl's house was empty, his horse gone. The foreman of the South Pasture operation told Nelson, with the flat eyes of a man who had been coached in what to say, that there was no James Ford working there, and there never had been. Nelson rode the south boundary lines until after dark, finding nothing but summer grass and cattle, and the particular silence that Kansas sometimes produced at night, enormous and directionless, as though sound itself had forgotten which way to travel. He returned to town well past midnight and lay awake in his room above the marshal's office, thinking about Bessie Ford's precise, searching eyes and the way she had said his brother's name, as though James Ford were someone she fully expected to find alive, and the refusal to expect otherwise was an act of will she was performing moment by moment. The next morning brought Earl Dunmore back to town, riding in casual and easy from the direction of the river, dressed well and smiling at everyone he passed. Nelson intercepted him at the livery stable. "Earl," he said, "tell me about a man named James Ford." Earl's smile did not change. Earl's smile, Nelson had come to understand, was a separate thing from whatever was happening behind it, like a door that had been nailed shut and painted over. "Can't say I know the name," Earl said. "He came looking for work about 6 weeks ago, had a letter of introduction to you." "People come looking for work all the time, Nelson. I can't keep track of every drifter." He patted his horse's neck. "Anything else?" "Not yet," Nelson said. Earl nodded pleasantly and walked toward the marshal's office as though he owned it. Nelson watched him go and felt the specific, focused anger of a man who knows he is being lied to and cannot yet prove it. He went to the boarding house. Bessie Ford had not waited idly. She had, in the single day since her arrival, spoken to the postmaster, the 2 bartenders at the 2 saloons, the woman who ran the laundry, and 3 of the cowboys who drank regularly at the Lucky Star. She had done all of this quietly and without drawing attention, and she presented Nelson with what she had learned over coffee in Mrs. Cartwright's front parlor with the same crisp organizational precision she had shown in his office the day before. James had been seen in Caldwell. Multiple people had seen him. The postmaster remembered him mailing letters. The laundry woman had washed his shirts twice. He had last been seen approximately 5.5 weeks ago at the Lucky Star Saloon, leaving with a man whom 2 separate witnesses described as Earl Dunmore's man. After that, nothing. Nelson drank his coffee and felt the ice-thin line between suspicion and certainty growing thinner. "You should not have been asking questions," he said, but his heart was not really in the reproof. "Someone had to," Bessie said simply. He looked at her across the parlor table, and for the first time let himself really look, not the quick cataloging assessment he had given her the day before, but something slower and more honest. She was not beautiful in the way the dime novels described Western women, all golden hair and helpless eyes. She was better than that. She was the kind of woman who looked more interesting the longer you spent with her, whose face changed constantly with thought and feeling, who clearly had a mind that moved fast and did not suffer itself to be wasted. She had, he noticed, dark circles under her eyes. She had not slept well. She was frightened for her brother, genuinely and thoroughly frightened, and she was handling that fear by working, by moving, asking, gathering, acting. He recognized the mechanism because it was his own. "We are going to find him," Nelson said, and he meant it with the full weight of a promise. Something in Bessie Ford's expression shifted just slightly, just briefly, the way a sail shifts when the wind changes. She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief but contained elements of both, and then she looked down at her coffee cup and the moment passed. "Tell me about Dunmore," she said. So he did. He told her what he knew and what he suspected, and it was the first time he had said any of it aloud to anyone, and the act of saying it organized his own thinking in ways he had not anticipated. Earl Dunmore had money that did not come from his deputy's salary. Earl Dunmore had connections to a cattle-buying outfit in Wichita that Nelson had been quietly investigating, the kind of outfit that bought cattle without asking too many questions about where they came from. And Earl Dunmore, Nelson had learned only 3 days ago from a circuit court judge passing through town, was about to become engaged to Clarissa Hawthorne, daughter of one of the wealthiest landowners in the county, a match that would give Earl Dunmore a level of social and legal protection that would make investigating him substantially more difficult. "He is getting married?" Bessie asked. "In 3 weeks, apparently. Clarissa Hawthorne, she is a decent woman. She does not know what she is marrying." Bessie was quiet for a moment. "And if James saw something, if he discovered something about Dunmore's operation, then he would be a liability," Nelson said. He said it because they both needed to hear the full shape of what they were dealing with, even though saying it felt like putting a knife down on the table between them. Bessie Ford absorbed this with a stillness that he found both admirable and wrenching. Her jaw was set. Her hands around her coffee cup were perfectly steady. "Then we need to find him before that wedding," she said. "Because after that wedding, Dunmore will be untouchable." "Yes," Nelson said. They looked at each other across the parlor table, and something was decided between them without either of them saying another word: a partnership, an alliance, a shared and urgent purpose that had nothing to do with the fact that Nelson Sutton had been thinking about Bessie Ford's amber eyes since the moment she walked out of his office the day before, and would go on thinking about them. The investigation over the following 2 weeks was not dramatic, most of the time. It was the patient, grinding work of building a case from fragments, riding out to the South pastures under various pretexts, talking to cowboys who might know something if approached correctly, following paper trails at the land registry office, asking questions of the cattle buyers in Wichita by post, and getting careful answers back. Bessie was with Nelson for much of it, in the way that a person who refuses to be excluded eventually cannot be excluded, and he had stopped trying to exclude her after the 3rd day, because she was observant and sharp and picked up details that he, for all his experience, sometimes missed. They rode together. They talked. Nelson learned that Bessie Ford had grown up in Springfield, Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and had become a schoolteacher herself, and that she had raised her brother James mostly alone after their mother died of fever when James was 12 and Bessie was 15. He was the only family she had left, which was why she had come 500 miles on a stagecoach and walked into a stranger's office and demanded answers with that particular quality of composed desperation that he had recognized from the very first moment. Bessie learned that Nelson Sutton had been born in Ohio, had come west at 19, had spent 4 years as a cattle driver and 2 years as a Pinkerton detective before taking the marshal's job in Caldwell, because he had wanted, for once, to put down roots somewhere and actually fight for a place, rather than just pass through it. She learned that he was methodical and fair, and that he took his duty seriously in the way that people take things seriously when they have thought about what the alternative looks like. She learned that he had a dry, restrained sense of humor that emerged unexpectedly and always caught her off guard, and that he was considerably kinder than his reserved exterior suggested. She noticed the way he moved, efficiently, without waste, the way men who have learned their physical safety depends on economy of motion tend to move. She noticed the way he listened, with his full attention, in a way that was rare enough to be striking. She noticed on the 4th day that he was watching her, and then looked away when she caught him at it, and that he did not look embarrassed but merely still, as though he was considering something carefully. On the 8th day, they found James Ford. He was alive. He was alive, but not well. He had been held in a lined shack on the far edge of the South pasture lands, a crude structure that was supposed to be used for cattle drives. He had been kept there under guard by two of Dunmore's hired men, given food and water enough to sustain him, but not enough else, with the implication that he would be released when Dunmore's business arrangements were sufficiently advanced that what James had seen no longer mattered. What James had seen was a herd of 300 cattle being transferred under cover of darkness from a ranch owned by a man named Aldrich Beaumont, a legitimate rancher, a pillar of the community, to a holding pen on Dunmore's land, and from there to the Wichita buyers at prices that no one involved could account for legitimately. James had had the bad luck to be present for this transfer, and the worse luck to be seen by Dunmore himself. Nelson and Bessie arrived at the lined shack on a Wednesday afternoon, having gotten its location from a young ranch hand named Peter, who was 17 and not yet entirely committed to the particular path Earl Dunmore was paving, and who, when Nelson explained to him in plain and serious terms that he was looking at either the right side or the wrong side of a very consequential moment, had made the right choice. Bessie had dismounted before Nelson had fully stopped his horse. She crossed the ground to the shack door at something close to a run, and had it open before the guard inside had time to fully react. The guard, confronted with both Bessie Ford's focused fury and Marshal Sutton's revolver, chose to sit down quietly in the corner while the situation sorted itself out. James Ford was thin and pale and had a bruise on his jaw that had mostly faded to yellow, but he was upright and coherent, and the moment he saw his sister, he went entirely to pieces in the dignified way that young men do when they have been holding themselves together through sheer stubbornness for weeks on end, and then see the one person who makes stubbornness unnecessary. Nelson stood outside the shack door and gave them 5 minutes. When Bessie emerged, her eyes were red and her jaw was working, and she looked at Nelson with an expression that contained about 10 different things at once, and she said, "Thank you," with a directness and simplicity that hit him in the chest like a fist. "Not done yet," he said, which was true. They still had to get James safely back to town, deal with the 2 guards, and build a case against Earl Dunmore sufficient to arrest him before his wedding gave him the kind of social armor that made Marshall's work in 1878 significantly harder than it should have been. They managed 2 out of 3 on the ride back to Caldwell. James rode with them, unsteady but determined. The guards were secured and escorted. The case, James's testimony plus the cattle buyer records Nelson had already gathered, was solid enough to move on. Earl Dunmore, however, proved elusive. He was not at his house. He was not at the marshal's office. He was not at the Lucky Star or the general store or anywhere else in town. And when Nelson asked around, he discovered the particular species of bad news that tends to announce itself through its own absence. Earl Dunmore was attending a wedding rehearsal dinner at the Hawthorne Ranch with some 30 guests and had been there all afternoon. Nelson installed James Ford at the marshal's office with a meal and a locked door for protection. He left word with his part-time deputy, a reliable older man named Clarence Webb, to stay with James and admit no one. Then he stood in the street in the long summer evening and worked out what he needed to do. He could arrest Earl Dunmore at the rehearsal dinner. He had cause. He had testimony and documents. What he did not have was a circuit judge in town. Judge Harmon had passed through 2 weeks ago, and the next circuit date was not for another 3 weeks, which meant Dunmore, once arrested, would sit in a jail cell that was technically part of his own marshal's station with the entire Hawthorne family, and their considerable influence brought to bear on the question of his release. He needed more time to build the case into something bulletproof. He needed to let the wedding proceed one more day, let Dunmore believe he was safe, and arrest him cleanly the day after with a proper legal foundation that could survive the Hawthorne family's lawyers. It was a calculated and reasonable decision, and it was also, Nelson acknowledged to himself as he went back inside, going to be one of the hardest things he had done in 3 years as marshal. Because he was going to have to tell Bessie Ford that Earl Dunmore was going free for another 24 hours, and he was fairly certain she was not going to like it. She did not like it. She heard him out in full, sitting at the desk in his office with James asleep on the cot in the back room, and when he finished explaining, she was silent for a moment in the way that meant she was thinking rather than the way that meant she was holding back anger, though there was, he suspected, some of both. 24 hours, she said, until after the wedding. Then I arrest him at the church or at the celebration afterward with the full case, before any money changes hands, and before he has a chance to use the Hawthorne connection to complicate things legally. Clarissa Hawthorne is going to marry a criminal, Bessie said, for approximately 1 day. And then she will be a widow in the legal sense while her husband faces a jury. Nelson met her eyes. I know it is not clean, it is the best I can manage given what the law allows me. Bessie was quiet for another long moment. She looked at her brother asleep on the cot. She looked back at Nelson. You give me your word that you will arrest him. I give you my word, he said. She nodded once slowly like a woman sealing a contract. Then I will wait 1 more day. He should have gone home. He had paperwork to do, plans to finalize for the arrest, a message to send to the county courthouse in Wichita requesting judicial presence. Instead, he sat across the desk from Bessie Ford in the quiet of the marshal's office in the late summer evening, with the oil lamp turned low and the sound of Caldwell settling into its nightly rhythms drifting through the window, and they talked. They talked for 2 hours. Not about James or Dunmore or cattle or the law, but about other things, about Missouri and Ohio, about what it felt like to be responsible for someone younger than yourself, about the particular quality of prairie grass in August, about books they had read and what they thought of them. Nelson discovered that Bessie Ford had opinions she did not qualify, and a laugh that came out unexpectedly, and was lower and freer than her usual voice, and that she argued about poetry with the same brisk authority she brought to everything else. Somewhere in the second hour, without fully deciding to, he told her something he had not told anyone in Caldwell, that he had come here not just looking for roots but running, to some degree, from a bad few years in his Pinkerton work when he had made decisions he still measured himself against late at night. Not violent decisions. He had not killed anyone who did not need killing, and he knew the moral arithmetic of that clearly enough, but decisions about who to protect and how far to go and where the line was between law and justice, which were not always the same thing. Bessie listened without trying to fix it or diminish it, which was the right response and also, he found, the one that made his chest ache the most. Is that why you are so careful? She asked. Probably, he said. It is not a bad reason to be careful, she said. And then, after a pause, it is a good thing that you are the one who is the marshal here, Nelson. It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed it the way you notice a match being struck in a dark room, not blinding, but suddenly very clear about where things are. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, Get some sleep, Bessie. Tomorrow is going to be a complicated day. She gathered her things and stood, and at the door she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at him with those amber eyes that he had been not quite stopping himself from thinking about for 2 weeks and said, Don't let him get away tomorrow. I won't, Nelson said. She went back to the boarding house. Nelson sat in his empty office for a while longer, listening to Kansas at night, and allowed himself approximately 10 seconds of acknowledging, fully and completely, what was happening to him where this woman was concerned, before he put it in a mental drawer and closed it firmly and went to write his report. The morning of the wedding arrived with the particular brazen cheerfulness that Kansas summer mornings sometimes produced, hot and golden, and utterly indifferent to the plans of human beings. The town had dressed itself in celebration mode. The Hawthorne family had money and Caldwell had relatively few occasions for festivity, so the whole community had embraced the event with enthusiasm. There were flowers on the church door, women in their good dresses, children running between adults' legs. Nelson spent the morning at his office, building his arrest documentation into a structure that could survive any legal challenge the Hawthorne family might mount. He had the cattle records. He had James Ford's written testimony, taken that morning with Clarence Webb as witness. He had a statement from Peter, the young ranch hand who had told them about the line shack. He had a letter from the Wichita cattle buyer who had, faced with the prospect of federal fraud charges, decided to cooperate with remarkable alacrity. He went to the wedding because the town expected it, and because his absence would have been noticed and might have warned Dunmore that something was coming. He stood in the back of the church in his good coat, his marshal's badge on his lapel, and watched the pews fill with Caldwell citizens and the Hawthorne family's connections and the bright, hopeful face of Clarissa Hawthorne at the altar in her wedding dress. And he felt the weight of the secret he was carrying, and the plan he had made and the promise he had made to Bessie Ford, and he watched the door. He was watching the door when Bessie Ford came through it. This is not what he had planned. This was not what they had agreed. She stood in the doorway in her blue traveling dress with dust on her skirt, and a letter crumpled in her hand and eyes scanning the congregation. And Nelson's first feeling was something close to alarm, because this was absolutely not what he had told her to do. And his second feeling, arriving immediately on the heels of the first and considerably more powerful, was something he had no useful word for, something that lived in the same neighborhood as recognition, as inevitability, as the sensation of a not giving way. She walked up the aisle with that terrible quiet dignity and looked at Earl Dunmore and said the thing that stopped every heart in the room. "Earl Dunmore, I want to know what you did with my brother." Nelson was moving before he fully decided to move, angling down the side aisle to get between Bessie and the front of the church. Not to stop her. He was already realizing that stopping her was probably not achievable, but to be there, to be adjacent to whatever was about to happen. Earl Dunmore had gone white and then red in rapid succession. He took a step away from the altar, toward the congregation, as though he might simply walk past Bessie Ford and out of the situation through the application of sheer social force. "I don't know what this woman is talking about," he said loudly to the room. "Her brother is alive," Nelson said, from his position now in the center aisle approximately 8 feet from Bessie. He said it not to her but to the congregation, clearly and without drama. "He was held for 5 weeks on Dunmore's land. I have his testimony." The congregation erupted. Clarissa Hawthorne's face in that moment was something Nelson would never quite forget. The way understanding and devastation arrived there simultaneously. The way she put her hand on the altar to steady herself. The way she looked at Earl Dunmore and saw him, truly, and for the first time. And what she saw did not match what she thought she had known. Earl Dunmore made a decision. Nelson could see him make it. The particular contraction of a man choosing flight over fight, and lunged toward the side door of the church, which was both predictable and, for Earl Dunmore personally, a significant mistake. Because Bessie Ford, who had been watching him with the focus of a woman who had spent 5 weeks being afraid for her brother, and was now channeling that fear into something sharper and considerably more purposeful, was faster. She stepped sideways and brought her booted foot down firmly on the hem of Dunmore's coat as he passed her, and Dunmore went down hard on the pine floor of the First Methodist Church with a sound that was both undignified and extremely satisfying to hear. Nelson was there before Dunmore could get up, one knee on the man's back and the handcuffs out, and the arrest of Earl Dunmore in the middle of his own wedding ceremony was accomplished with a dispatch that would be talked about in Caldwell for years afterward. There was a great deal of noise. There was crying, some of it from Clarissa Hawthorne's family, some of it from other sources. There was the low thunder of a congregation's outrage rising and sorting itself into the various camps that outrage in small towns always does, those who were shocked, and those who said they had always known, those who focused on the crime and those who focused on the spectacle. Through all of it, Nelson was aware of Bessie Ford standing in the middle of the church aisle watching him with an expression that was, for once, entirely unguarded. The composure that she carried like a second skin had cracked open, and what was behind it was naked relief and exhaustion and something else. Something that she had clearly been carrying alongside the fear and the fury. Something that bloomed open now that the danger was past and the promise was kept. He got Dunmore to his feet and to the jailhouse, with Clarence Webb's help, and then turned Clarissa Hawthorne over to her family and her grief with as much gentleness as the situation allowed. He made arrangements. He gave statements. He did the work that the law required. And then, when the late afternoon sun had shifted to evening gold and the church had emptied, and the town's excitement had settled into the long, buzzing murmur that follows dramatic events, he found Bessie Ford sitting on the church steps with her blue dress still dusty, and her hair fully escaped from its pins now, and the crumpled letter still in her lap, looking up at the Kansas sky with the expression of someone who has just set down something very heavy. He sat beside her on the steps. For a while neither of them said anything. "That was not the plan," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I told you to wait." "I know," she said again, and there was something in her voice that was not quite apologetic, something that suggested she understood the rule she had broken and had broken it anyway because a different kind of calculus had taken over. "I received a letter this morning from one of Dunmore's men, an anonymous one, through the post office. It said that if I did not leave Caldwell by noon, my brother would not survive the week." Nelson went very still. "It was a threat," she said. "And when I thought about waiting one more day, sitting and waiting while someone knew I was here and was willing to threaten James again, I could not do it, Nelson. I could not sit still anymore." He thought about this. He thought about the letter and the threat and what it said about the level of desperation in Dunmore's operation, and he thought about how Bessie Ford had handled that level of desperation, not by fleeing and not by freezing, but by walking into the middle of a church full of witnesses, and making it impossible for Dunmore to do anything quietly or privately or without consequences. "It was the right decision," he said after a moment. She turned to look at him. "Was it?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "In the open, in front of witnesses with me present, there was nothing he could do. You made it impossible for him to act quietly. That was smart." A pause. "Or it was panic that happened to work," she said. "Those are not always different things," he said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh and then looked back at the sky, and the evening light was very warm and the day's tension was unwinding itself by degrees, and Nelson Sutton was sitting on the church steps of Caldwell, Kansas, next to Bessie Ford, and he was not thinking about cattle records or depositions or the long report he was going to have to write. "What will you do now?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I need to see James properly settled. He has no intention of going back to Missouri. He says there is nothing there but old memories and that the West suits him." A small pause. "I believe him. He is 22. Everything suits the young." "And you?" Nelson said. Another pause, this one longer. "I have leave from my school until September. I had not thought beyond finding James, to be truthful. I had not let myself think beyond finding James." The sun was sinking toward the horizon, and the Kansas sky was doing what Kansas skies did in the evenings, turning impossible colors, purpling and orange at the edges. The kind of thing that in the East people thought was an exaggeration until they saw it. Nelson was aware of Bessie Ford's shoulder approximately 3 inches from his own, and the fact that the 3 inches had decreased at some point without either of them moving deliberately. "Stay for a while," he said, and he said it with a simplicity that he was aware was slightly terrifying. Bessie Ford looked at him sidelong. "I have a job in Springfield." "Until September." She was quiet. "Caldwell is not a bad town," he said, "under the current circumstances." "You mean without the deputy who was holding my brother captive?" "Among other improvements." She was looking at him now with an expression he was learning to read, that particular quality of stillness that meant she was measuring something, weighing something, considering the full shape of a thing before she committed to it. It was the same expression she wore when she was about to ask a question that cut directly to the center of whatever was being discussed. "Nelson," she said. "Yes. Are you asking me to stay because of James or because of some other reason?" He held her gaze. He had spent 15 years as a man who chose precision over ease in his professional life, and who had never quite managed to apply that principle to his personal one, partly because his personal life had offered very few situations that demanded it. This one did. "Both," he said, "but mostly some other reason." Bessie Ford looked at him for a long, clear moment, and then she looked back at the sunset, and there was something in her expression that he would have described, if pressed, as quietly radiant. "I will stay until September," she said, "and then we will see." James Ford recovered fully within a week. He was young and had the recuperative powers of the young, and he was also, it became clear, exactly the kind of person who meets a difficult experience by leaning harder into the thing that caused it, not in a reckless way, but in the way of someone who has looked at the dark side of something and decided that the thing itself is still worth wanting. He wanted the West. He wanted Caldwell specifically. He found work within a fortnight with a legitimate ranching operation run by a man named Harlan Briggs, who had no connection to Dunmore's affairs, and who appreciated a young man willing to work long hours without complaint. Earl Dunmore's trial was held 6 weeks after his arrest, when the circuit court came to Caldwell. The case Nelson had built held up with a thoroughness that gave him professional satisfaction. Dunmore was convicted of cattle theft and illegal confinement, the latter charge pressed specifically and with considerable determination by James Ford's testimony and the documentation Nelson had assembled. He was sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Leavenworth. Clarissa Hawthorne, who had initially been protective of the situation out of understandable shock and wounded pride, had come around entirely by the time the trial happened, partly because her father, once he understood the full scope of what Dunmore had done, was righteously and permanently furious on his daughter's behalf, and partly because Clarissa herself was a genuinely decent woman who, once the wool was fully removed from her eyes, had no interest in defending a criminal. She thanked Bessie personally before the trial, in a brief and dignified conversation outside the courthouse that Nelson witnessed from a respectful distance. He could not hear what was said, but he saw Clarissa Hawthorne take Bessie's hand in both of hers and say something that made Bessie's expression go soft in a way he was only beginning to see clearly. When Bessie came back to where he was standing, she did not say what had been said, and he did not ask, because some things were between women and belonged there. Bessie stayed for August. The days that month had a quality that Nelson found difficult to name, but would remember with great clarity for the rest of his life. A slow-burning, ordinary magic, the kind that builds not from dramatic moments, but from the accumulation of small ones. Morning coffee shared at the boarding house when he came to give her updates on the trial preparation that they both knew were sometimes slightly more elaborate than strictly necessary. Afternoons where she sat in the school room that the town schoolteacher, currently absent on summer leave, let her use, reading to children who had nothing particular to do and whose mothers were grateful for the respite. Evenings when she met Nelson at the end of his rounds and they walked the length of Caldwell's Main Street while the heat of the day finally released, and the sky did its nightly spectacular work overhead. They talked constantly, in the way that two people talk when they have discovered that talking to each other is one of the better available activities, that the other person's thoughts are interesting, and the exchange produces something neither of them would have reached alone. They argued about things. They found agreement in unexpected places. Nelson discovered, not for the first time but more powerfully than before, that being fully known by someone, not the marshal, not the badge, but the person underneath, was something he had missed without fully understanding that he had been missing it. On the 17th of August, Nelson rode out to the south pastures on a routine matter involving the land registry now that Dunmore's property was in legal limbo. And Bessie came with him, because the day was fine and she had nothing more pressing, and he had stopped pretending that her company was not something he deliberately sought. They stopped on the high ground above the valley in the late afternoon and looked out at the grassland spreading in every direction, golden and enormous, the cattle small and dark in the middle distance, the sky beginning its evening performance above it all. It was the kind of view that tended to produce either silence or honesty, and with Nelson and Bessie it produced both at once, which is to say it produced the kind of silence that is also honest. "I wrote to the school board," Bessie said after a while. Nelson looked at her. "About my leave," she said. "I asked about extending it through the fall term. They have a replacement teacher in place and she is apparently doing well." He was very still. The kind of still that is not calm but the opposite of calm, carefully contained. "And," he said. Bessie turned to look at him, and the evening light was full on her face, and she was the woman who had walked into his office with a letter and amber eyes and a composed and furious love for her brother, and she was more than that now. She was the woman he had spent August with, the woman whose voice he had come to locate automatically in a room, the woman who had changed something in him that he suspected was permanent. "They said yes," she said. He looked at her for a long, full moment, measuring what he was about to do against everything that could go wrong with it, and then he let go of the measuring and trusted the thing itself, because some decisions are made long before the moment you acknowledge them. "Bessie," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean." "I know," she said. "So when I tell you that the best month I have spent in Caldwell and quite possibly anywhere has been this last one, you understand that I mean it precisely." Her expression was the radiant, quiet one, the one he had learned. "And when I tell you that I would like to spend the next several months in a similar fashion," he continued, "and that I would like to do that honestly and with intention, you understand that also." "I understand that also," she said. "Good." He reached out and took her hand, which was resting on the saddle horn, and she turned her palm up immediately and held his hand back with the same directness she applied to everything. And it was like, he would think later, much later, on other evenings, like coming inside somewhere warm after being in the cold for a very long time. They stayed on the high ground until the sun was fully down, and the stars were making their appearance in the enormous Kansas sky, and rode back to Caldwell in the dark with their horses side by side, and the town lights coming up ahead of them like a small constellation brought down to earth. He kissed her for the first time on the steps of the boarding house, which was not the most private location, but was where they happened to be when the moment arrived in that irreversible way that certain moments do, when delay becomes not caution but cowardice. She kissed him back with the unhesitating wholeness that was characteristic of Bessie Ford's approach to everything she decided to do, and the world did not fall apart, and the stars continued their business, and Caldwell made its nighttime sounds around them, and it was exactly right. September came. Bessie's extended leave ran through October. By the middle of September, the question of her returning to Springfield in October was being approached with the slightly elaborate casualness of two people who have agreed on the destination, but are still working out how to say so aloud. James was the one who finally precipitated it. He came to dinner at the boarding house Mrs. Cartwright, who had taken a proprietary interest in both Ford siblings since their arrival, had been feeding the whole group every Sunday in a gathering that had grown to include Clarence Webb, who was a widower, and who had been coming for the food and staying, because Mrs. Cartwright's conversation was considerably sharper than expected, and James arrived at Sunday dinner in late September with the air of a person who has made a decision. "I am staying," he said, before anyone had finished the soup. "In Caldwell, permanently. Harlan Briggs offered me a full-time position and I have accepted it." There was a round of congratulations and Mrs. Cartwright refilled everyone's soup bowl with the air of someone formally ratifying a decision. In the short silence that followed, James looked at his sister across the table and said, with the directness of someone who has spent 5 weeks in a lined shack with nothing to do but think and has therefore acquired a certain impatience with unnecessary indirection, "Bess, you know you do not want to go back to Springfield." Bessie looked at him. "You have been here for 8 weeks," James said. "You are teaching children you enjoy, you have friends," and he glanced briefly at Nelson and back with a complete absence of subtlety. "And other reasons." "James," Bessie said. "I am just being accurate," James said, and applied himself to his soup with the serenity of a younger sibling who has landed a blow and knows it. Nelson, who had been watching this exchange with an expression that he was carefully keeping neutral, looked at Bessie. Bessie looked at Nelson. The table managed to become very interested in Mrs. Cartwright's soup. "I will write to the Springfield School Board again," Bessie said, in a tone that managed to be both dignified and exactly what Nelson had hoped to hear. He reached under the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers laced through his immediately. James smiled into his soup. Caldwell's schoolteacher, whose name was Martha Gillespie, returned from her summer leave at the end of September and proved, in the way of good people meeting other good people with a professional overlap, to be immediately and thoroughly fond of Bessie Ford. The two women reached an agreement of considerable practical genius within 1 week of Martha's return. Bessie would teach the younger children in the mornings, Martha the older children in the afternoons, which solved the ongoing problem of the Caldwell School being too small for its student population, and gave both women work they wanted to do. The Springfield School Board received Bessie's letter of resignation in mid-October. This left the question of permanent lodging, which was resolved through a conversation that Nelson had with himself first, and then with Bessie in the marshal's office one Tuesday afternoon in early October. He had spent the previous Sunday constructing the conversation in his head and then dismantling it and rebuilding it, which was unlike him. He was not, generally, a man who prepared speeches, but this was not a general situation, and he found that precision mattered here more than perhaps it had mattered anywhere else. In the end, he put the speech aside and simply said what was true. He told her that he loved her. He said it with the directness and the full meaning that she had every right to expect from him, because she was Bessie Ford, and she deserved to be told things clearly and not made to interpret them. He said that he would like her to stay permanently, and that he would like, if she wanted the same thing, to make her a formal offer of a permanent kind. And he said it without a ring because he had not had the foresight or the emotional clarity to obtain one before the moment arrived, but was prepared to correct this oversight immediately. Bessie Ford listened to all of this with her hands folded on the desk and her amber eyes on his face, and an expression he could not quite read, which was unusual, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment that felt considerably longer than it probably was. Then she said, "I love you, Nelson Sutton. I have been, I will admit to you now, in a considerable amount of difficulty about this since approximately the second week, when you told me about your years at the Pinkertons, and I understood that you were the kind of man who holds himself accountable to the hardest standard he knows." Nelson absorbed this. "And yes," she said, "to the permanent offer once the ring is obtained." He went to the jeweler's that afternoon. The ring was a modest gold band with a small garnet dark red, which he chose because it was the color of amber in certain lights, and because it was honest, not trying to be more than it was, clean and real and meant to last. He gave it to her that evening at the boarding house in front of James and Mrs. Cartwright and Clarence Webb, which was not the private moment he had originally intended, but Bessie had showed no signs of minding witnesses, and the room responded with an enthusiasm that he found privately rather touching. They were married in November, which was not a particularly romantic month for a wedding in Kansas, but was when they wanted to do it, and the First Methodist Church of Caldwell was full, and the reverend who officiated managed not to reference the incident 3 months earlier with notable professional grace. Clarissa Hawthorne came to the wedding. She came alone and dressed simply, and with a dignity that Nelson admired, and she hugged Bessie at the reception with what appeared to be genuine warmth, and said something quiet in her ear that made Bessie smile. She left early and gracefully, and Bessie, later, told Nelson that Clarissa had said she was glad the church had been used for something good. The reception was at the Lucky Star, which the owner had closed to regular business for the evening, and decorated with more enthusiasm than artistry. And there was dancing, and Mrs. Cartwright cried and James danced with every woman present in the way of a young man who is happy and healthy, and has decided to be grateful for it. And Nelson Sutton danced with his wife, and found that the word, which he had never applied to anyone before, settled over Bessie Ford with a rightness that he felt in his bones. They moved into the Marshal's house that winter, which was a modest frame house on Oak Street that had come with the position, and which Bessie organized with a brisk, purposeful energy that transformed it from a bachelor's sparely inhabited space into something that was actually, clearly, a home. She put books on the shelves and curtains on the windows and argued with Nelson about where the kitchen table should go with a cheerful combativeness that he thoroughly enjoyed and eventually conceded, because she was right about the light. Winter in Caldwell was quieter than the other seasons, which suited them. They had long evenings and long conversations, and the particular daily intimacy of sharing a life with someone, learning the rhythms of another person, the way they sleep and work and worry and laugh, the small architecture of a shared existence that is built piece by piece without fanfare, and is, in the end, the most substantial thing people construct. Bessie continued teaching through the winter. Her younger students were devoted to her in the way that children become devoted to teachers who take them seriously, and she took them very seriously indeed, in the best possible way, with warmth and high expectations, and a patience that she had in considerable reserve when the object of it was worth the expenditure. Nelson's work settled into the particular rhythms of a town without a corrupt deputy at its center, which was to say it was more manageable, and, he found with some residual surprise, still entirely satisfying. He had been half worried, without fully acknowledging the worry, that removing the Dunmore problem from his professional life would somehow remove the sense of purpose that had kept him rooted in Caldwell. What he discovered was that the purpose was the town itself, the ordinary daily work of keeping a place safe and fair, the slow accumulation of a community's trust, which was its own kind of wealth and more durable than most. He hired a new deputy in January, a man named Samuel Reeves, 28 years old, who had come down from Dodge City with good references, and the specific kind of competence that showed itself in how a man handled a problem before it became a crisis. Samuel and Nelson worked well together, which was a thing Nelson appreciated with a gratitude that was sharper and more specific than it might once have been. In February, Bessie told him she was expecting. He was at the kitchen table with a report when she told him, and he put down his pen and looked at her with a kind of ringing internal silence that preceded, he discovered, the largest happiness he had experienced in his adult life. She was watching him with those amber eyes and a slightly uncertain expression, because Bessie Ford, who was afraid of very few things, was in this moment vulnerable in a way that made him cross the kitchen immediately and take her face in his hands. "Bessie," he said. "I know it is soon," she said. "We have only been married 3 months." "I know how long we have been married," he said. "I just want to make sure that you, Bessie," he said again, and then he kissed her in a way that he hoped resolved any remaining uncertainty about how he felt, and from the way she kissed him back it appeared to work. James, when informed at Sunday dinner, went somewhat pale, and then extremely pleased in rapid succession, and then spent the next 20 minutes telling everyone at the table what Bessie had been like as a child in terms that Bessie found unnecessary and Nelson found delightful. The pregnancy was straightforward. Bessie was healthy and energetic, and refused to be treated as fragile, which was consistent with her character, and which Nelson respected even when his instinct was to be more protective than she would allow. She continued teaching until May, when the heat became sufficient that Mrs. Cartwright and Martha Gillespie combined forces to insist she rest, and she complied with the compromise of reading to her students from the porch of the school building until the final week of the school term. Their son was born in August, 1 year and 1 month after Bessie had first arrived in Caldwell on the stage from Wichita with a letter and dust on her blue dress and eyes that could not be stopped. He was born in the early hours of a hot morning, with Dr. Aldous Webb, no relation to Clarence, in attendance, and he announced his arrival with a volume and conviction that suggested he had inherited his mother's fundamental conviction that if you had something to say, you should say it clearly and without hesitation. Nelson held his son for the first time in the pre-dawn darkness of the bedroom on Oak Street, and felt something happen in him that he had no adequate words for. A shift in the architecture of what mattered, a new axis around which the whole world silently reorganized itself. "He is perfect," he said, which was what people always said and was, in this case, entirely true. "He is very loud," Bessie said from the pillow, with a smile that was tired and whole and beautiful. "He has his mother's opinions," Nelson said. They named him Henry James Sutton. Henry for Nelson's father, James for the uncle who had been, without knowing it, the cause of the entire sequence of events that had brought his parents to each other. James Ford, the actual James, met his nephew the next day and held him with the careful, overwhelmed reverence of a young man encountering the fact that a family has expanded, and then said, in a voice that was slightly thicker than usual, "He looks like he knows things." "He is 2 days old," Bessie said. "I stand by the observation," James said. Henry Sutton was, in the event, an excellent baby in the sense that he was vigorous and communicative and profoundly interested in his surroundings from the very beginning, which meant he was somewhat demanding, but in a way that was never frightening, only time-consuming. Nelson adapted to fatherhood with the same methodical attentiveness he brought to everything, learning the particular language of his son's sounds, the rhythms of his needs, the way Henry's face changed when he was focusing on something new, which from early on was often. Bessie returned to teaching in October, bringing Henry in his basket to the schoolroom in the mornings, in an arrangement that Martha Gillespie approved of with characteristic pragmatism, and that the children loved unreservedly. Henry became, somewhat accidentally, the best educational tool in the school's arsenal, a living lesson in biology, in the care required by living things, in the way that love is also work, and the work is also love. The following year passed in the full abundance of a life that has found its form. Nelson's work was steady. The town was growing. Caldwell was on its way to becoming a significant cattle town, which brought both prosperity and the complications that prosperity brings, and Nelson navigated those complications with the care of a man who had thought hard about the relationship between law and justice and had arrived at a workable understanding of both. Bessie's teaching expanded. She had by this point convinced the town council to fund a second classroom, and had recruited Martha Gillespie's younger sister, newly arrived from the East, to staff it. The school that had been crowded and insufficient when Bessie arrived was, by the fall of 1880, a functioning educational institution that served every child in the district regardless of background or circumstance, including the children of the small community of freed black families who had settled south of Caldwell, and whose children had previously had no schooling available to them. Bessie pressed the council on this point with the patient, inexhaustible determination that was one of her defining qualities, and the council, having dealt with Bessie Ford Sutton in one form or another for over 2 years by this point, yielded. Nelson was proud of her with a specificity and depth that he found he could not quite contain sometimes, that occasionally showed on his face when he watched her in public, at a council meeting, at a school event, in any of the dozen settings where Bessie Ford Sutton was clearly and visibly the most capable person in the room. He had married a remarkable woman and he knew it, and he did not try to be moderate about knowing it. They found, as the months accumulated, that their marriage had the particular quality of things that are both chosen and inevitable. A partnership so functional and so honest that it was also, without either of them needing to announce it, deeply romantic. They still argued about the kitchen table, which had been moved twice more, and was currently in a location that was a compromise between both original positions and that Bessie maintained was suboptimal. They still talked for hours in the evenings when Henry was asleep. They still rode out to the high ground above the South Valley, sometimes on good afternoons, and the Kansas sky still did what it always did, and Nelson still reached for Bessie's hand on the saddle horn, and she still turned her palm up immediately. Henry learned to walk in January of 1880, which he accomplished with the forward-leaning, all-in commitment that characterized everything he did, and promptly applied his new skill to getting into everything in the house that he had previously been unable to reach. He was a serious, curious child with his father's watchful dark eyes and his mother's quick, expressive face, and he charmed the population of Caldwell with a thoroughness that was entirely unconscious and entirely effective. In the spring of 1880, James Ford proposed to a woman named Clara Reeves' sister to Deputy Samuel Reeves, who had moved to Caldwell the previous year to live with her brother, and who had met James at the Sunday dinners that had become a fixed institution at Mrs. Cartwright's house. Clara Reeves was 23, dark-haired, funny, and entirely capable of managing James Ford's particular brand of enthusiastic chaos, a quality that Bessie identified within the first month of knowing her and approved of wholeheartedly. Their wedding was in June of 1880, and it was, Nelson observed to Bessie on the way home, a considerably less eventful ceremony than the one at which they had first understood what they were to each other. "I find I prefer it that way," Bessie said. "So do I," Nelson said, and reached across the buggy seat for her hand, which she gave him as she always did, without reservation and without ceremony, in the simple, abundant way that had become the central fact of his daily life. Henry, who had attended the wedding in Bessie's arms and had conducted himself with a gravity appropriate to a 19-month-old at a formal occasion, fell asleep on the drive home against his father's shoulder, and Nelson held him with one arm and held Bessie's hand with the other, and the summer Kansas evening spread itself out around them in every direction, enormous and golden and entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary. The way that evenings do when you are where you are supposed to be, and with who you are supposed to be with. In September of 1880, on the second anniversary of Bessie's arrival in Caldwell, Nelson came home to find the house smelling of the pot roast that Bessie made on occasions she considered worth noting, and Bessie herself in the kitchen with an expression he recognized. The quiet, radiant one, the one that had appeared first on the church steps when he had told her the arrest would happen, the one that meant something had shifted into place. "I have news," she said. Henry, playing on the kitchen floor with the collection of wooden blocks that James had carved for him, and that he treated with a focused proprietary seriousness, looked up briefly and then back at his blocks. "Good news," Nelson said, because he knew her face. "We are going to need another room," she said. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest, and they stood there for a moment in the warm kitchen on Oak Street in Caldwell, Kansas, with the evening coming in through the windows and their son arranging his blocks on the floor, and the 2 years that had grown from an afternoon, when a woman walked through his office door with amber eyes and a letter, and the specific fierce love of a sister, who will not accept the absence of the person she is looking for. Those 2 years were present in this moment, the way the river is always present in the valley, shaping everything that grows there. "Another room," Nelson said into her hair. "I am thinking a boy would be fine," she said, "but a girl would also be entirely fine." "Either," he said, "both, As many as you like." She laughed against his chest, that lower, freer laugh that he had heard for the first time in his office over a discussion of poetry, and that still, reliably, produced in him a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen stove. Their second child, a daughter they named Ruth Eleanor Sutton, Ruth for Bessie's grandmother and Eleanor, because it was simply a beautiful name, and they both felt it was born in April of 1881. She arrived with considerably less noise than her brother had, which initially caused Dr. Webb brief concern and caused Bessie no concern whatsoever. "She is thinking," Bessie said with perfect confidence from the delivery bed, and indeed Ruth appeared from her very first moments to be of the contemplative disposition, watching the world with wide dark eyes that seemed already to be cataloging and assessing, which was, Nelson thought, very much her mother's daughter. Henry met his sister with the solemn importance of a child who has been prepared for this moment and takes preparation seriously. He looked at her for a long time and then pronounced her small, with an accuracy that no one could dispute, and patted her hand with a gentleness that made Bessie's eyes fill, and went back to his block satisfied. Earl Dunmore at Leavenworth was not thought of very often in the Sutton household. He existed at the edge of the story, the way villains do once they have been resolved, as the occasion for something, not the thing itself. He had been the reason for the letter that James wrote to his sister. He had been the reason Bessie Ford had stood in the doorway of a Kansas church on a summer afternoon with dust on her blue dress and fury in her eyes, and 5 weeks of fear and love for her brother compressed into that single quiet sentence that had stopped the room. He had been the reason Nelson Sutton had moved down an aisle with his hand on his revolver, and his eyes on a woman he could not stop watching. People were the occasion for each other, in the West as everywhere. The land put you in proximity to what you needed, and it was up to you what you made of the proximity. Caldwell grew. By 1882, it was a proper cattle town, one of the largest in Kansas, with the complications and the commerce and the life that came with that designation. Nelson's work expanded with the town, and he added 2 more deputies, and the marshal's office moved to a larger building on the main street. He was, by this point, a known quantity in the county, the kind of lawman that people came to with problems, not because he was the most dramatic or the most fearsome, but because he was the most reliable, and reliability, in a place where fortunes and futures could turn on whether the law held or broke, was worth more than drama. Bessie's school by 1882 was the thing she had made it, a real institution, with 4 classrooms, and a library that she had built through donations solicited with such focused persistence that the town council had largely stopped even pretending to resist. She had by this point taught a full cycle of Caldwell's children through to the end of schooling age, and the effects were visible in the town, in the children who had grown up knowing things and expecting to continue knowing them, in the confidence of young people who had been treated as worth educating rather than as an obligation to be minimally discharged. James and Clara Ford lived 2 streets away and had, in 1881, a son of their own, another Henry, which produced a family conference about nomenclature and resulted in James's Henry being called Harry, a distinction Harry himself would object to strenuously once he was old enough to have opinions about things. Harry and the Sutton Henry were inseparable from infancy, which was convenient for the adults and, Nelson suspected, would eventually be inconvenient in the way that 2 best friends with complementary skill sets tending toward adventure usually became inconvenient. Mrs. Cartwright continued her Sunday dinners until 1883, when she married Clarence Webb in a ceremony that surprised everyone except, it emerged, Nelson and Bessie, who had been watching it develop for 2 years with what they described privately to each other as the satisfying recognition of fellow travelers. The dinners continued after the wedding, now hosted jointly by the Webbs in their combined household, which was larger and better equipped and still smelled of Mrs. Cartwright's soup. In the autumn of 1883, 5 years after the moment that had started everything, Nelson Sutton sat on the porch of the house on Oak Street in the long evening and watched his children in the yard. Henry at 7, serious and curious and increasingly resembling his mother in his approach to any problem, and Ruth at 2.5, who had recently discovered the capacity for running and was applying it comprehensively to everything. Bessie came through the door with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him, and the evening light was doing what it always did over the Kansas grassland, and the town made its sounds in the near distance, and the life that had grown from a chance and a choice and a woman who walked through the wrong door at exactly the right moment was present in every direction he looked. "What are you thinking about?" Bessie asked, and gave him his coffee. He considered the honest answer, which was that he was thinking about all of it, the sum of 5 years, the beginning of it, the church door and the crumpled letter and the arrested room, and the first moment he could not stop watching her, and everything that had grown from that moment outward in every direction like grassland from a river. "The beginning," he said. Bessie settled beside him with her coffee and her composed, warm, familiar presence, and looked out at the yard where their children were. "I should not have walked in like that," she said, for perhaps the 3rd time in 5 years, a periodic and diminishing acknowledgement. "Yes," Nelson said, "you absolutely should have." She looked at him sidelong. "If you had waited," he said, "Dunmore might have gotten the message out in time if you had been patient, which I was not." "Which you were not," he smiled, "just slightly, then perhaps James would not have been safe. Perhaps the arrest would have gone differently. Perhaps I would not have been in the right place," she said quietly. "You walked into the wrong wedding," he said, "and nothing was wrong about it at all." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard. Ruth had sat down in the grass with the emphatic plop of a small person who has decided to change activities, and Henry was standing over her with the expression of an older sibling attempting patience. "I have been thinking," Bessie said, "about something." "What?" "A 3rd classroom at the school," she said, and he laughed, not because it was unexpected, which it wasn't, but because it was so completely Bessie Ford Sutton, always building, always thinking about what was needed next, always moving toward the thing that could be better. "Or," she added, after a brief pause with that quiet, radiant expression, "possibly a 3rd room in this house again." Nelson Sutton set down his coffee cup on the porch railing. He reached over and covered her hand with his, and she laced her fingers through his without looking, the way she always had, and the evening light poured over Caldwell, Kansas, like something out of a dream that turns out, against all reasonable expectation, to be entirely real. "Both," he said, "in whatever order you prefer." And Bessie Ford Sutton, who had arrived in Caldwell on a July stage with dust on her dress, and amber eyes full of fierce love for her brother, and no idea at all about what she was riding toward, smiled at her husband in the long light of the Kansas evening, and said, "I think I prefer both at once." Behind them the house was warm and full. Around them the prairie stretched in every direction, vast and golden and indifferent to human plans and human hearts, except that it was also the place where their plans and their hearts had found each other, and that was not nothing. That was, in the end, everything.